Tonight we'll do Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 10. I'm not sure whether we'll get quite all the way there through them, but at least we'll begin. Let's first begin just by reading Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 and 2, since they're kind of important, although they seem fairly sort of lightweight, but I don't think that they really are. And they really prepare the ground for not only much of what is left to come in Matthew's gospel, but also for much of what is left to come up to the destruction of the temple in 70. So what is left to come, in fact, after the period in which St. Matthew wrote his gospel. So we'll read that and compare it to the other three gospel accounts, which are only slightly different, but different in kind of a illuminating way. So I'll read from St. Matthew, chapter 27, verse 1. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. So the parallel account is just one verse in Mark. It's chapter 15, verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate. So a consultation, as opposed to took counsel against Jesus. Luke is chapter 23, verses 1 and 2. So at the end of chapter 22 in Luke, Jesus is condemned for blasphemy. Then in 23, then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man perverting our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king. So there's no consultation or anything else. They just take him and bring him before Pilate. And then John, chapter 18, verses 28 through 32. In John, there's a somewhat fragmented course of events. Annas, who is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, first questions Jesus. Then in verse 24 of chapter 18, Annas sends Jesus to Caiaphas. And we don't know what happens while Jesus is at the house of Caiaphas. But the account continues in verse 28. And they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early. They themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. And then there's the appearance before Pilate. So there's the irony that they are have falsely and know that they've falsely accused somebody, that they've handed him over to death, and yet they don't want to enter the room in which there's a Gentile so that they won't be defiled by it, because they want to remain ritually clean, even though they're murderers. Is there anything striking about Matthew's account or anything that's notably different? We've talked a lot about prophetic enactment in Matthew, that in some sense Many of the actions recorded in Matthew's gospel represent a playing out or an acting of, of scriptural prophecy. So does anyone see any possibility here? There's one phrase that stands out. 2 words.
Bound him.
That's a good one. We will talk about that later. Oregon talks about it in a very creative way, but that's not quite it.
Okay.
Or actually, in some ways, it's related to it.
Delivering him?
But what?
Delivering him?
That's important too, but that's not quite the key phrase.
Then let him.
He took counsel.
Took counsel.
Took counsel.
Took counsel. Who takes counsel? I think I'm sure we've read it before, but let's read it again.
Sanhedrin.
Elders of the people.
The people.
Sanhedrin.
Priests, chief priests and elders of the people.
Right. So it's the Sanhedrin here who's taking counsel.
Sanhedrin.
But let's look at Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together. So you notice the take counsel together. It's the same phrase that Matthew uses as the Septuagint version of the Psalm uses. The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. So here you are, Mary, here are the bonds.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll discuss in a bit what Oregon says about the bonds. But so he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with the rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, with trembling rejoice, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. So the kings of the earth are taking counsel to destroy the Lord's anointed. And so what is the result of that?
Angering the Lord, for one.
Right. And what else?
Well, it says here, kings, priests, and sometimes prophets are anointed with oil and thereby consecrated for a special mission from God. So they're supposed to be doing God's work instead of ganging up against him.
Right.
So he terrifies them with his fury too.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So look at verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. So the two consequences are derision and laughter, that this attempt to destroy the Lord's anointed is ridiculous and going to fail. And two, the outpouring of wrath and judgment. So this is significant as a prophetic enactment. So we're seeing what we're seeing here is an enactment, an enactment of Psalm 2. The kings of the earth and the rulers are taking counsel together to destroy the Lord and his anointed. And that is laughable because you can't destroy the Lord and his anointed. And they will be destroyed. So the implication of this is that the kings of the earth, and actually I haven't looked to see what the word for earth is, but I'm wondering if it's gi. But I don't know. I failed to look, for which I apologize. But so in any case, the elite is plotting. And what's laughable is that they think that they're plotting the destruction of the Lord's anointed. But what they're actually plotting is their own destruction.
Another irony.
Mm-hmm.
So in a more, I guess, symbolic, whatever, practical, procedural, chronological way, what is happening here? Why do they need to confer?
You mean confer with Pilate or confer with each other?
They're conferring with each other before they hand him to Pilate. But why are they conferring with each other when in chapter 26, verse 66, they've already pronounced what they feel is the judgment? What is your judgment? They answered him, he deserves death.
Well, now they're just making sure they're all on the same page. They're covering themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Right,
not
so-
going to have just one of them go and turn them over and say, well, this is what we decided, and then have the rest go back on it.
But also more than that, Jesus,
Well,
they've convicted Jesus of blasphemy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
But he didn't blaspheme.
Well, even if he did or he didn't, blasphemy is of no concern to Pilate. Pilate isn't going to sentence anybody to anything for blaspheming Yahweh. That's just not his concern. So, you blaspheme Yahweh, that's good. You don't blaspheme Yahweh, that's good. Whatever. It might be even better to blaspheme than not blaspheme. So, Pilate is a Roman, obviously, and he's responsible to the Roman emperor. Actually, he's directly responsible to the governor of Syria, and then through him to the Roman emperor. And he's religiously, he would be, devoted to the Roman gods and to the emperor as God. And so Yahweh has no place in his worldview. And he could care less about, the fine points of the Jewish religion, for which he probably has contempt. So they have to present a case that Pilate is going to find acceptable, that is going to merit the death sentence under Roman law. So then we have the binding him.
Which again wasn't really necessary because he was going. He was not fighting them. He was being very passive.
Right. He's offered no resistance, so there's no need to bind him. So one of the possible reasons is to make sure that there's absolutely no way that he can escape. Remember, going back to chapter 26, in verse 5, it said, but they said, not during the feast, lest there be a tumult among the people. So binding at least manages to keep him under somewhat better control, unless in the event that there's a riot or an outbreak of violence, or some of his followers try to snatch him away or whatever. But it also has an important visual effect. When you see somebody who's bound being brought in front of you, you know that what they've done is serious. Like if you're on an airplane and you see somebody with a handcuffed person, you know that they're
You want off the plane?
you might want off the plane. What about the bonds? So going back to Psalm 2,
Mhm.
verse 3, or going back, actually starting again at verse 1. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. So those who are taking counsel together imagine themselves freeing themselves of their bonds. So they become free of the constraints imposed by the Lord. And so they're becoming free of those constraints by binding Jesus. But what's going to happen?
Yeah, lose, be destroyed. They'll have nothing that they're going to be ruling pretty soon.
It's Jesus. Oregon argues here that it's that they're planning to burst the bonds of the Lord, but it's Jesus who breaks the bonds which they've literally put on him, and that they in turn become bound. Then hand him over. Led him away and delivered him, handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Does the handed him over sound familiar? The Greek word paradidomi. Does it sound familiar at all?
Well, only from the other gospels. But there's probably something in the Old Testament.
Well, here it's in Matthew, it's chapter 20.
Well, that was half a year ago, Ron.
Yeah, it wasn't recent.
More than.
Chapter 20.
Verses 18 and 19.
Well, it was more than a year ago.
Oh, you have the date?
It was in September last year.
Well, so yeah, we've done like 7 chapters in a year. That's
So we might be done by Easter.
You know what I'm noticing though? By doing this one so thoroughly, it makes the others, because there's some so many similarities, it makes the others make more sense now too.
So what you're saying is we're really doing 4 gospels instead of just 1.
Or at least 3.
well,
Right. Right.
also makes the Old Testament make a great deal more sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, we're also,
Yeah, no, I recognize what's happening here.
yeah,
It just is nice to be able to tease you a little bit.
we're also getting a good background in the Old Testament
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
relationship
we're really
between,
understanding how the old and the new fit together.
Right. Mm-hmm. So 20 verses 18 to 19. So this is where Jesus begins to turn southward as they make their final journey to Jerusalem, where he knows that he's going to be executed. In verse 18, he says, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him and hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day." So this is Jesus' most detailed description of what will happen in the Passion, and his first mention of being handed over to the Gentiles.
It says it's the third time he foretells his death and resurrection.
It's the first time he does it in detail.
Hmm.
Remember, the first time is with Peter, and that's very fragmentary. And then the next time is a little bit more detailed, and then this is still much more detailed.
Hmm.
So he adds detail as we go along, or as he goes along, and the disciples go along, since obviously they're not very prepared to handle it. Handed over is also being handed over is also prophetic. But let's look again at Isaiah chapter 53.
Suffering servant.
Yeah, suffering servant. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. For he was wounded, so notice there, yet we esteemed him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. So God himself stands behind the handing over. He's been struck down by God, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So notice the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The Lord has been involved, and he was handed over. So similarly, in Romans 8, Paul says that God did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us. So in some form, God is active in Jesus being handed over. And so we kind of see the irony of Psalm 2 and the laughability and the derision that God is expressing, that the elites think that they're destroying Jesus. They think they're handing him over to Pilate, and yet God is the motive force behind this, although that doesn't absolve them in any way from their responsibilities. And they in turn will be destroyed. So they think they're handing over, but in some sense, in an ultimate sense, they're handing themselves over. There's also the handing over is also significant because John the Baptist was handed over. And Jesus talks about his followers being handed over and appearing before governors. So this handing over is looks backward to the persecution of John the Baptist and therefore also the persecution of the prophets. And it looks forward to the persecution of Jesus' followers. The final thing is delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Does anyone detect any irony there?
Well, Pilate represents the king. The king is being handed over to a representative of a king, so to a lower person. And it's all at the direction of the real king.
Uh-huh.
And weren't they always running away from the Roman government? I mean, weren't the people always feeling like they were being oppressed by the Roman government?
Yeah,
And
although this
going
is
to them to
this is the
do their
elite though.
business?
This is the elite though. So their relationship is, I guess you could say a love-hate relationship with elements of antagonism and mutual dependence.
Mhm.
I mean, so, and Caiaphas, remember, is the chief priest for a very relatively long period of time. John makes the comment twice that Caiaphas was the chief priest that year. And in fact, Caiaphas was not the chief priest for only 1 year. And so some commentators have argued that it shows that John wasn't very familiar with the office of chief priest. But in fact, John there are, on the one hand, that year simply means the year in which the judgment of Jesus took place, but it's also an ironic comment from John. He's the chief priest that year because most of the chief priests served for 1 year. And so the chief priest, which is supposed to be the high religious office, descended from Aaron.
Levi.
Yeah. Is instead a Roman puppet, an appointee of the Roman governor or the emperor, and therefore is sort of a plaything to be replaced at will. And then going back to that, since Caiaphas is in office for so long when most governors serve only 1 year, it indicates that he's really is a very successful self-serving political operator, which is hardly a high comment. He's in some sense the chief priest who's the anti-chief priest. Certainly not a holy man, but an opportunistic, manipulative one. So irony in Pilate, the governor, does anyone see the element of irony as we go forward and recall what Pilate does in the Passion narrative.
Well, he tries to get out of condemning him.
Uh-huh. But he doesn't.
He
No, he
washes
gives
his
him an
hands.
opportunity to select him to be spared. And they didn't, the people didn't take it who were there.
So he's not behaving like a governor.
Mm-mm.
I mean, a governor is someone who, so in this case, he's responsible to the Romans. I mean, he is Roman. He's responsible. He's a representative of the Roman state. He, therefore should be expected to behave as a representative of the Roman state and as a governor, you make decisions. And he simply goes with the flow. So he doesn't make a decision.
Mhm.
So
Well,
that's not
And he washed his hands saying, that
right. He washed his hands.
this isn't, yeah.
Yeah,
What I agree with.
that's not something that a governor should be doing. And it's kind of like, the Harry Truman phrase, the buck stops here. Whether you make a good decision or a bad decision, you should make a decision and take responsibility for it. But not making a decision isn't acceptable. So is there anything else about Pilate, Governor?
He certainly wasn't able to govern with an indecision.
Right, here he's indecisive. Think about the creed. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, consubstantial with the Father. Through him all things were made. For us men and for our salvation, he came down from heaven, and by the Holy Spirit was incarnate of the Virgin Mary, became man. For our sake, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, he suffered death and was buried, and rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He was
He was really
crucified under
crucified
Pontius
under the people.
Pilate. Why is that there? And why is it in Matthew's gospel and in
Because he was responsible regardless of whatever he decided.
That's one thing, he was responsible. But what else?
I guess it was during his reign as a governor that Christ was crucified.
Right. So an important thing is that this links the life, ministry, and death of Christ to a known historic figure. And that's important.
Just
So,
like his birth was linked to the census. Of the house of David.
Pilate was governor from 26 to 36. So he's appointed by the emperor, but he's responsible to the governor of Syria. And as it happens, he's far more well known than most Roman governors, partly because some coins that he minted have survived. There's a stone, it's called the Pilate stone. It's a damaged block of carved marble, of carved limestone rather, that survived, that reads, to the divine Augustus Tiberium. So it's to Emperor Tiberius. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. It's probably from the cornerstone of a building that hasn't survived. Then there are all New Testament accounts of Pilate, but then there are in the Gospels, in Acts, and First Timothy, but then there are also accounts from Philo and from Josephus. Philo records an episode in which Pilate placed gilt shields with the image of the emperor in Herod's palace. And there was a good deal of unrest about that, and a petition to remove the shields, or to remove the image on them. Pilate refused. The crowd asked for evidence of a command from Tiberius, the emperor, that allowed him to do this, or they would petition him. And then Philo says, but this last sentence exasperated him in the greatest possible degree, as he feared lest they might in reality go on an embassy to the emperor and might impeach him with respect to other particulars of his government, in respect of his corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people and his cruelty and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. Therefore, being exceedingly angry and being at all times a man of most ferocious passions, he was in great perplexity, neither venturing to take down what he had once set up, nor wishing to do anything which could be acceptable to his subjects, at the same time being sufficiently acquainted with the firmness of Tiberius on this point. So he was ultimately commanded by Tiberius to move the shields to the temple of Augustus in Caesarea. And then Josephus records an incident in which Pilate brought ensigns with Caesar's image into Jerusalem. So there was a massive 6-day protest. So Pilate surrounded the crowd with armed troops, threatened to kill everybody. But when the members of the crowd expressed their willingness to die rather than to surrender, he withdrew. Then he built an aqueduct to carry water from 25 miles away into Jerusalem, and he paid for it with, remember the Korban? So he paid for it with Korban. So there was general outrage. The temple funds were being used to fund the aqueduct. So there was a protest that resulted in fairly wanton killing of both participants, rioters and non-rioters, as well as in the panic that resulted in a large number of people being trampled to death. Then a false Samaritan prophet led a group of people to Mount Gerizim to see the sacred vessels hidden there by Moses. They were intercepted by Pilate. Some were killed, and others who fled were captured and then sentenced to death. And finally, in response to his general brutality, the Samaritan Senate sent legates to the Council of Syria, Vitellis, who then removed Pilate and ordered him sent back to Rome. So Pilate was not a very likable person. So for Pilate, rubber stamping the Sanhedrin's decision is not something that he would want to do. And so there's a certain element of anti-Semitism in his passivity. And it's kind of really expressed a bit more fully in a different encounter in Acts chapter 18. Paul is in Corinth, and there's a general attempt to get him sentenced to death by the Jewish religious leadership. And then in verse 12, it says, but when Gaius was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack upon Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading men to worship God contrary to the law. When Paul was about to open his mouth, Gaius said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, I should have reason to bear with you, O Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. So in some sense, that's Pilate's own attitude. This is really not my problem. No concern of me.
Wasn't it his wife that said she had had a dream?
Yeah, we'll discuss that in a little more detail when we get to it. The general view is that Pilate, that Matthew's gospel and the gospels as a whole really let Pilate off for his responsibility. But I don't think that's actually the case. And so one of the things that indicates it's not the case is that his wife had the dream, and he nevertheless didn't, follow up on, what the dream should have led him to do.
Yeah.
And I think that there is an underpinning of, I think that Matthew is also pointing to an underpinning of anti-Semitism here, that this is simply not his problem, because this is fundamentally a really stupid debate about a God that he doesn't recognize and blaspheming a God who he doesn't recognize, and who cares about that. Blaspheme, no blaspheme. Maybe blasphemy is a little bit better than no blasphemy. I mean, who cares? And, their customs and their law are stupid anyway. So, I mean, that's I think an element of anti-Semitism. We've done 2 verses tonight.
Yeah, will we come back and review them next week?
What, Mary?
Will we need to review them next week?
Yeah, we just scratched the surface. So I would say we probably have 2 to 3 more weeks on these 2 verses. No, next week we'll continue. Next week we'll continue with verse 3.
Okay.
So if you get a chance, look at the next section, the prophetic part, so that the prophecy might be fulfilled, draws heavily on Jeremiah and Zechariah. It's Zechariah chapter 11. And then also in Jeremiah, he draws on Jeremiah chapter 18, chapter 19, and chapter 32. That scriptural fulfillment is leaves a great deal to the imagination, which is what Matthew is trying to do. And if we try to kind of weave together the threads as Matthew, I think, did, then we see really a powerful reenactment of what happens when the kings and the rulers take counsel against the Lord and His Anointed. That a real paradox occurs, that those who think that they're in control are literally digging their own grave.